All right. Hi, everybody. Hi. Thanks so much for your attention. I know it's been a really interesting morning with lots of great content. This will only continue at the lunch hour with our conversation. I'm so excited to have Fatima Goss-Graves, the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center here. Before I introduce Fatima, let me just say quickly, I'm Melissa Murray. I am the co-faculty director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. We are doing amazing things here at the law school, and we just brought in our first cohort of Moss Leadership Fellows, a group of 1L women, 12 1L women, that we will be shepherding through the entire law school experience, teaching them leadership skills, helping them to develop their voices as leaders, with the idea that what they learn here at the law school, they will later go out into the profession and use to transform the profession to the better. And so we're really excited about the work we're doing. This symposium is part of that effort. And we're so glad to be able to bring this kind of content both to the NYU community and to New York City more generally. Today's guest, Fatima Goss-Graves, really needs no introduction. She's the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, the preeminent public interest law firm focusing on women's rights. She is a graduate of the University of California at Los Angeles and the Yale Law School. Prior to going to NWLC, she was an associate at Meyer Brown and Platt, so she is very familiar with all of these issues in big law. And before that, she was a law clerk to the Honorable Diane Wood on the Seventh Circuit. Before she became the president and CEO of the National Women's Law Center, she served in many different roles in the organization, most recently as senior vice president for program, where she had oversight of the entire policy and litigation program for the organization, and she has now stepped in to helm the entire organization. You've seen her all over Twitter and Instagram. She's always in the mix with Tarana Burke and Ai-jen Poo, and all of the leaders of the Me Too movement, and basically anywhere where women's rights are being discussed, Fatima Goss-Graves is there. So please give her a warm welcome to NYU.
It's nice to be introduced by Professor Murray. I'll just say that. Thank you.
So we've talked a lot this morning, but I want to go back to the beginning. So the whole point of this symposium was to reflect on the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act at 10. So as Dean Morrison told us this morning, tomorrow marks the 10th anniversary of this landmark legislation. And so just to give us some context, who was Lilly Ledbetter? Who is Lilly Ledbetter? How did she come onto the scene? And how did we get to this landmark federal policy?
Sure, and so I love talking about Lilly Ledbetter, and if you haven't had an opportunity to see her in person, meet her in person, no one tells her story better than Lilly herself, with her very deep Alabama accent and straight talking approach. And I raise that because it became important, and I think one of the reasons it became one of the main issues in the 2008 campaign. Lilly's story is not a typical story. She worked for many, many years and received lower pay, including lower pay than the men that she was supervising. And she found out towards the end of her career at Goodyear Tire and Rubber because someone left an anonymous note in her mailbox. And they had her salary, and then they had the salaries of the men who were being paid more. So on her first day off, she went down to the EEOC to figure out what she could do about that. So Lilly filed a lawsuit against Goodyear. I will bore you with a lot of the details, but just know by the time it got to the Supreme Court, every circuit except the 11th Circuit had a general rule, and that was as long as you had a paycheck that was infected by discrimination, you could continue to sue your company to stop that discrimination. So in 2007, in 2007, yes, the Supreme Court said, no, that's not true. That actually the statute of limitations runs at the beginning of when that pay decision was made. And for Lilly, that first lower pay decision was made about 20 years ago. And that she should have challenged that unfair pay then. And it was a 5-4 decision written by Justice Alito, and it was one of the first major decisions that came out without Justice O'Connor on the court. And there was a decision, and at the time, she had not done that very many times. She has since done this a number of times, but Justice Ginsburg read parts of her decision, her dissenting from the bench. And in her dissent, she said, you know, clearly the court doesn't understand how pay discrimination actually works in the workplace. Congress, the ball is now in your court to fix this mess. And so that began an effort to get Congress to try to fix the mess. That began an effort to really begin to talk to the public about the issue of fair pay, which is not a new problem, right? The 63 Equal Pay Act had banned it first. But at the same time, it was not an issue that had broken through in tremendous ways. I was at the National Women's Law Center as a senior counsel at the time. I'll say maybe about 5 to 10% of my time was spent on that issue before the Ledbetter decision. So the Ledbetter decision and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act not only revealed problems in the law, some of which were fixed by the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, most of which were not fixed by the Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, but it culturally brought us to a very different place in terms of the issue of equal pay.
So this was a very procedural issue in Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire, like whether or not the statute of limitations told. But as you say, Justice Ginsburg, in reading that incredibly fiery dissent from the bench, kicked the ball to Congress. Congress responded, but more than just this legislation, we got the start of a really rich and deep conversation about pay inequity, how it happens and what the drivers are. And we've seen some of that surface. One of the main drivers, though, in the Lilly Ledbetter's case makes this clear, is the lack of transparency.
That's right. I mean, the idea that you could go for such a long period and not know, part of it was on purpose. Goodyear had a rule that said you weren't allowed to talk about your pay. So if you could either violate that rule and talk about your pay, and at the time, there was a lot of pushback from some who were saying we should go after the person who put the anonymous note in the mailbox. Clearly, they were violating that rule, right? So that was a rule, and those sorts of very closed and completely closed pay systems are not uncommon. Some research has shown that about a third of employees work in systems like that. At the same time, it wasn't the only problem. Since that time, Lilly has talked about a number of things that have contributed to her lower pay. She's talked about the harassment that she endured while at Goodyear, and it revealed how all of these things were interlinked. But because of that aspect of the Fair Pay Act, one of the things that we tried to do when the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act came up for the vote was also pass the Paycheck Fairness Act, which the House did pass. The Senate did not. The Senate decided to put it in committee.
What does the Fair Paycheck Act do?
So the Paycheck Fairness Act would go further to update our equal pay laws and deal with additional problems of transparency, problems that the incentives are sort of off and the penalties for violating fair pay are actually not that high, and close some loopholes in the law, which I can get into if you want me to. But what happened then that was important was that the Senate didn't take it up right away. So the first bill that was signed into law was Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. President Obama signed it in 2009. And all the while, the Senate still had to work on this other bill, the Paycheck Fairness Act. It came 2 votes shy of passing in 2010, and so we got 2 votes shy means you get 58, so not enough to overcome the filibuster. And so it kind of died at that moment temporarily. And what happened after that is that the administration started looking at what it could do on its own. And one of the things that it did that was really important was it looked at the issue of federal contractors, and it said federal contractors could not ban people from talking about their salaries. So Goodyear was a federal contractor, so Goodyear should not have that policy anymore, because if it does so, it's violating that executive order. But that was one of the wins that came out of that.
Is that executive order still in place today?
It is still in place.
Don't tell anyone.
No, no, we should tell everyone. It is not a controversial executive order. And after that time, a number of states have also passed laws that say that explicitly too, that that employees can't be penalized in any way for talking about their pay. It's not a requirement that employees talk about their pay, but they shouldn't suffer a penalty for wanting to share their pay information.
So Lilly Ledbetter learned about the gross disparity in her pay, even between her and people she supervised at the end of her career. What's the real impact of the pay equity on women's material lives?
And again, Lilly talks about this beautifully, but at the end of her career, she had grown children, and she talked about hard times as she was raising them, right? And times when she was really struggling to pay for childcare, struggling to pay and just make ends meet in their family, groceries, basics like that. And she kept saying, well, if I had had a higher wage, maybe that struggle wouldn't have been as hard. And today she talks a lot about how her decades of unfair pay are showing up in her retirement. So, your retirement is based on the pay that you made. And she, because she lost in the Supreme Court, Congress overturned that ruling, and it was a beautiful thing. But Lilly Ledbetter is never going to get that money back.
So we just spent about an hour and a half talking about salary negotiations. And I think having good strategies for negotiating your salary is hugely important, but it's not the full remedy. So in a way, it's almost a kind of neoliberal remedy to put the onus on individuals to get the employer to do better. What else should we be doing?
Yeah, and I would go even further, although there was a part of me that thought I need to be in touch with one of these people to coach me as I'm dealing with my next salary situation. And the other part of me, which is probably the stronger part of me, really thinks it's the wrong conversation to have. The right conversation, in my view, is around how do employers change the way they are setting salaries. And the reason that I believe that actually pretty strongly is whether you are a powerful negotiator or not a powerful negotiator typically does not actually translate you into whether you are actually the better employee. And I do not see a way out, a negotiating way out of the many biases that come into play. I mean, I was trying to listen closely, and if you listen closely, there were lots of tips that really do follow the research about the right ways for women to negotiate, to be seen as not so aggressive and also not emotional, and also not all the other things that are stereotypes that women hold and bear. And even then, still, it's not clear that you are going to actually negotiate in a way that overcomes those biases, and the risk, the penalty risk, is really high. And so I really struggle with that. And instead, when I've been thinking about things I'm excited about things like the bans on salary history. And the reason I'm excited about that is it is pushing employers to take a step back and think about how is it that we do set salary. If I can no longer just match the last salary that you had or use that to peg you, what should I be pegging you on? Well, maybe what I should be trying to figure out is what is this particular job worth? And also looking at internal equity. Right? So even if Jane negotiates marvelously and they say, you know what, we're bringing Jane in at $100,000, and that is the right thing to do. But if Paul makes $70,000, Jane and Paul are going to have a problem in a year or two, right? Because that employer is going to have a real difficulty justifying maintaining a huge salary disparity that it created only for the purpose of the ability to negotiate and maintaining that going forward. So another thing I'm really excited about is the idea that employers are regularly looking at their salaries, looking for pay disparities by race and by gender, thinking about what is driving them, and then and then doing something about it. And if the only thing that is driving your pay salary gaps is the ability to negotiate, I think you're going to have a problem. So really trying to deal with it at the front end is important. And what we know is that those gaps start, the pay gap starts when you enter that first job, and it's kind of hard to overcome, right? Or at another important moment in a restructuring, at a big promotion. You know, there are only a few times where it really comes, but then if you are already behind, it is hard for that employer to catch you up. So when you're thinking about employers that are trying to be proactive, reducing your reliance on negotiation is one pathway.
So I think that's really interesting. Let me push back and play devil's advocate. So for about 17 months, and I remember every one of these 17 months, I was the dean of a law school. And I had to deal with salary disparities, and I learned about salary disparities. Like the first thing you do when you become dean of a law school is they usher you into this office, and there are file cabinets. And the first thing I did was open the cabinet, see the one that said Melissa Murray, and started reading that one first. But they're like files on all of the faculty, all of your employees, and you learn about, even at a public school. I was at a public school where there was ostensibly transparency in salary, but there are all of these little side deals that people have negotiated, all sorts of things that you would not know about that aren't readily apparent. We keep talking about how women and people of color are underpaid, but we haven't really talked about the fact that men, and maybe white men particularly, are overpaid, and that ties the employer's hands. Like if there's a finite amount of money to be distributed, and believe me, at a public law school, there's a finite amount of money to be distributed, even recognizing that there are disparities, there's not much you can do if you don't have any kind of flexibility because of what you have available to divvy out. And if some people are at the higher end, I mean, I think about the salary cap in basketball. You can't get new players if you have a star player who's occupying most of your cap room.
So I think a couple of things. The first is, you know, when you're talking about really highly paid overall jobs, it may be true that you have that men are overpaid, but in general, people generally are underpaid right now, that salaries haven't kept pace in the way that you would expect. And so one of the things in many organizations that might have to happen is a shifting overall to allocating more money to paying workers as a result of this. And you know, the current job market is probably helping that happen a little bit, but not as much as people would have expected given how low the unemployment rate is. But to your point, you know, it is really difficult because a lot of institutions can creatively find funds to pay for things they really want to pay for. And so, you know, we often hear this, that someone who knows they have a really big pay problem kind of doesn't want to look at it because they're like, we have a really big pay problem. Once you start looking at it, and then you really know about it, and then you really have to correct it. And so the incentives are all wrong there. And what I would say is you end up getting a really big pay disparity, a really big pay problem, because you aren't looking on a regular basis and addressing it when it's actually a smaller one.
So let's go back to what you were saying about Lilly Ledbetter's retirement. At the end of her career, she not only reflected on what the impact of the pay disparity was for her life with her family, but now what it would mean going forward. So she basically, your retirement benefits are based on your base salary, and if you're being underpaid, that's a problem. It's also a problem if you're negotiating and you're negotiating for things other than base salary. So can we talk a little bit about that? Like, this is one of the things, and you know, there was a discussion earlier in the earlier panel about whether women, more so than men, were likely to be susceptible to getting the flexible work time as part of a salary negotiation as opposed to actual dollars. What are the real downsides of negotiating for those soft things?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing because I think there is a presumption, and I was glad to hear, I can't remember who was on the panel that said it, that like you could easily feed into the stereotype that women are going to want family benefits, and men are not going to want or need those family benefits. And if you actually look at some of the legislative history and statements when the Equal Pay Act was passed, there was this whole conversation around who was the real breadwinner and who was not the real breadwinner, and why do people work? Like, what's the point of your working? And if you are perceived as working for the benefits, or largely valuing the benefits more than the money, those perceptions are actually going to drive some of the decision making, even when you think you're negotiating on a fair field. But your second point is a really important one, in that negotiating for things like longer paid leave or particular schedules are not going to show up in your retirement. And in my view, companies should be looking at those as overall shifts to ensure that they are having the sort of workplace that responds to what the reality is today, and that is that most people both work and engage in care. And that there is a reason to do that that is bigger than that there is a reason to do that is bigger than even thinking about equity. There is a reason to do it because people are expecting companies to think about those things and it is one of those things that companies are now being rated on far more publicly. And so there's a little bit of a race among some companies to announce their paid leave policies, the fact that they have fair schedules. And if you have a policy like that that's available to everyone rather than just negotiated, you're more likely to have a situation where both men and women participate in the policy. So the penalty of participating in the policy won't be a problem.
And also, too, just having, whether it's paid leave or flex time, made a part of the default employment package gives the worker more opportunity to actually focus on salary as a condition of employment as opposed to these other things. So it's sort of making, like, the shift that you're talking about, instead of salary negotiation but changing policies, actually will aid negotiations if you're really just wanting to get to better salaries.
That's right. And in truth, for something like paid family and medical leave, really, as employers who are out there on their own, it could be a difficult thing to do, especially with smaller employers. And that's why it's been really important for us to be driving towards a national standard, a national policy, one that doesn't rely on you having to be at an employer that is having really flex times or an employer that is not, really making a commitment as a nation that we, like almost every other nation in this world, think things like paid family leave is important.
So you were dealing with stereotypes anytime you were thinking about salary and work, and with sort of the ongoing history of the fact that women historically were not part of the workforce. And so we're fighting against the stereotypes that are produced by women's historic exclusion. Let's talk about some of the other stereotypes that are at play, because there are stereotypes about women of color and work. Women of color have always worked, but maybe not in these C-suite type white-collar jobs. Likewise, men of color have always worked, but again, not in these spaces. So how does the overlay of not just race but class affect the way these inequities get perpetuated and become durable?
That's right. I mean, what's interesting is that the wage gap for African American and for Latinx and Native American women is much higher, and for some populations of Asian women is much higher than it is for white men or white women. And there are a range of factors that drive that. Some of them are things that have nothing to do with an apples to apples comparison. Some of it is historically being shut out of some of the highest paid fields and being dramatically overrepresented in many of our lowest paid fields. So when we think about equal pay solutions, we think about solutions that include things like raising the minimum wage and addressing pipeline and diversifying hard hat jobs. I mean, it's a range of solutions that would really be required. But the racial and sex tropes that follow people, even in the same job, play out in a lot of different ways. And I know one of the last panel had a little bit of a conversation about, there's some research that shows, and it actually maps onto what younger girls believe about themselves, that Black women are more likely to be seen as leaders, and they're more likely to be seen as aggressive. Even when Black women think they're not being aggressive, by the way, they're more likely to be seen as aggressive, right? So you have that trope. And so some people have said, well, that means that they are considered to hold these leadership qualities already, so easy for them to just be leaders. And then it makes people ask, well, why is it just that Ursula Burns was by herself on the CEO list for so long, right? Well, part of it is there aren't that many leadership opportunities that just show up for Black women, right? And the pathway of getting into that leadership slot is you have to go through a lot of non-leadership roles. And let me tell you, being the angry Black woman at work does not necessarily help so much in those non-leadership roles, right? So this disconnect between the various stereotypes that people are holding and how that translates to promotion opportunities, how that translates to pay, is one that is very tight.
And Ursula Burns is the former CEO of Xerox.
Yes,
that's
right. We all should know Ursula.
We should
she
all
was
know
by
Ursula.
herself for many years.
She also has a really interesting story that relates to a lot of what we're talking about. So she talks about her rise at Xerox being a product of the fact that she married a man who was 15 years her senior. And as she was sort of beginning her climb, he was ready to retire and happily raised their children. So, I mean, like, these things are...
And it relates to another thing that shows up in the research, which is what we call the motherhood penalty. That even when they have tried to do controlled studies around fathers and mothers, that fathers get a pay bump in these negotiations while mothers take a hit. And so even, the stereotypes that we have about the seriousness of someone in a role, their effort, are very much also connected to whether or not they have those sorts of caregiving responsibilities and show up in your pay.
Personal story. At one point in my career, I was negotiating. I had an offer from another school. I was negotiating with my dean, and he said to me, Melissa, that's an unreasonable amount of money. You don't need that money. Your husband's a lawyer. I was like, and so am I. And so am I.
We hear these types of stories a lot, and I've told people a few years ago we had a case in New Jersey, and I honestly, when we first got the call about this case, I kept saying, "Is this real? Is this real?" Because they said things out loud that typically people don't say out loud, and they wrote things in policy that typically people don't write in policy. And their formal policy was that the men could have family benefits, so family health care, but the women could not, because the men were the breadwinners that had to care for the families, but the women could not. So of course, as you would expect, there was a woman who needed family benefits, whose husband was not employed, and she couldn't believe that she could not insure her family. And we couldn't believe it either, because it was a very clear violation of the equal pay laws, and they had written it down for us in their policy, which was a very convenient way to litigate a case.
I mean, the other thing, too, about some of this stuff is it's so reflexive. Like, the person with whom I was negotiating is not, like, a troglodyte. I mean, he's a really great person and someone I would think is very enlightened. But the durability of the stereotype is just so reflexive. The family wage, like, your husband provides for you.
Which is one of the reasons why one of the things I'm excited about is the employers who are doing a lot of work to come up with a few more rules and systems to save us all from ourselves. Like, the rules and systems acknowledge that people are going into it with a set of stereotypes. So because of that, what are some of the other things that I should be looking for and thinking about when I'm setting those salaries? And even for those who are very into the negotiation piece as a driving factor, one of the things that I think your last panel talked about was women negotiate a little bit more equally to men when they have similar sets of information. So you've seen some employers putting out pay ranges that are a little bit more specific, so you know what the actual range is, and you're not going way above, and so everyone says this person isn't serious, or so far below, because you don't realize what the range for this organization is.
So, I mean, there's a lot you can say about just sort of changing the landscape, like changing the defaults would actually enhance the individual's opportunity to negotiate if that's what he or she wants to do. And
the employment, and I actually think changing it will help employers too, because you know, to a person, if you negotiate one way and then you get there and you feel good about it and then you talk to your neighbor and you found out that you actually got a raw deal, you are not going to feel good in that workplace. So they are setting up a system where someone who you may have really wanted to be here and are excited about is going to start potentially on a sour note.
so I guess one of the Bibles of negotiation is getting to yes. Right? So everyone heard of getting to yes? Yes. And one of the hallmarks of getting to yes is that you should always be prepared to walk away, to just like throw down your marbles and leave. How likely is that to happen in an employment situation? Like what happens if you are in the process of trying to negotiate and you can't say no?
I mean, it's a very real thing, because your ability to turn down that good job, or your ability to walk away from the job that you have, to sort of close the door and say, I'm done here if you don't give me $10,000, probably is very closely tied to your ability to sustain yourself without work, right? If you don't have another offer and you don't have another way to pay your bills month to month, and I think the recent shutdown has revealed for us how true that is for so many different people at a lot of different income levels and in a lot of different jobs. And so, you know, all of those things have very significant class and race dimensions, again, none of which really relates to the ability for that person to do a great job for you, right?
Yeah. You're a boss.
I
Like
am now.
figuratively and literally. How do you negotiate with your employees?
So it's interesting. I mean, it is much easier to be on the other side and sort of nipping and saying, don't do that, and don't do this, and don't do that. And then you have to be an employer and actually implement the practices that you think are important. And that's something that we're really committed to at the Law Center, the things that we are urging private sector employers to do. We are looking at ourselves like, how would we do that, even though we're much smaller than a lot of organizations, but we're large enough to be able to put many things in place. So we don't match salaries. We do put out information about the median salary for on our job postings. And when we are talking to people and about particular positions, honestly, we talk to them about our values around internal equity. And we have that conversation with people, why we think that's important, why we think it's not an okay thing for two people doing the same job to be paid dramatically different salaries, even if you're coming and having made a lot more, which sometimes happens, right? Sometimes we'll get someone from a law firm. They were making a lot more than the person who came from a nonprofit, without having even looked at their salary. They just were making a lot more, right? Or even people who are coming from high-level government positions may have been making a lot more. And so we could say, well, we have to match your salary, but we don't.
And this goes back to the banning the question, what is your current salary when you're going to a new job?
It's true. I mean, again, you know, a lot of states and localities have moved in that direction. A number of organizations have moved to totally different systems and no longer do that salary matching. It's a part of the Federal Paycheck Fairness Act law. I think it's a thing that is going to come more and more. And so my advice is, how else are you going to set your salaries then? So rather than just matching the salary, which allows people, mostly women, to carry lower pay from job to job to job and never catch up, thinking about, how do I value this person right now who's before me and working in my organization now?
Yeah. No, it's a really an interesting question. And how would you respond as an employee if I were your prospective employer saying, Fatima, can you tell me your current salary so I can work out a benefits package for you? What would you say?
As the employee? Well, it's harder for the employee, right? If the employer tells you to say it, you're going to always say it, right?
You?
I need the negotiation experts. Maybe they'd say, don't say it, especially if you know you were making less, but then it's a little bit more confrontational. Sometimes what I've seen people talk about is what their salary expectations are. Well, if they're moving from organization A to organization B with the hope of making more money, hopefully their salary expectation is higher than the one that they were making before, and so hopefully they aren't going to salary match themselves if they have an option.
So one woman, a colleague who I think is really tremendously good at these sorts of things, like it's always standard in academia, like the next dean will ask you, what's your current salary? And if you're at a public school, they can go find it. So it's a totally lazy question. But if you're at a private school and it's less transparent, they will ask you. And she said, you should always say, well, you know what salaries are for my cohort. Why don't you tell me what you think I'm worth? And then sort of kick it back to the employer. And is it hostile? Does it feel aggressive?
Well, it probably does feel aggressive coming from a woman. But in any event, I also wonder if another question is, what were they paying the last dean? Yeah. I mean, if the last dean was, if they had decided they were paying the last dean a particular salary, unless you think that salary is especially low, why shouldn't you make that salary or perhaps even more if you're bringing even more to the role?
Well, so that is an interesting question. Like, I had this issue. So I became the interim dean after a huge, very public sexual harassment scandal. And when I got the salary package, it actually was less than what I made as a faculty member. And I said, hey guys, I may be out of line here, but I'm not going to do this huge cleanup job for less than what I make as a faculty member. Why don't you pay me what you were paying him? And then they had this whole litany of reasons. Like, I was so much younger. He had been in academia for longer, and this whole thing. And the only time movement came was when I said, I don't have to do this. But like, again, I had someplace else to go. I had other things I could have done. Right. If you don't have that, you might have to suck it up. And
it's true. And I think you'll hear over and over where people take a role that they really want and love and are excited about for pay they know
this was not that role.
For pay they know is low for exactly that reason. But I also think challenging how exactly we're setting this pay is important. Now, it may have been that this person's decade of experience more was a really legit reason to pay him more. But was it enough of a reason to pay for the entire gap? And that's another thing that we hear about. Someone will say, well, I'm only, you can't ask for that. You have fewer years of experience. This person has done X or Y. So we're going to pay you $100,000 less. Well, does that actually translate into the way that you're thinking about it?
No, that's a good point to sort of reframe it as, is it commensurate with what the expanse of the gap itself? A final question before we open it up to the audience. We keep hearing about all of these different movements, like the effort to diversify workplaces, especially like the sort of upper echelons of the legal profession, that's been discussed a lot. Me Too and sexual harassment in the workplace, and now this. And in the first panel, I asked a question about these things are so siloed, but it seems like they're so completely related. So from your perspective, leading the National Women's Law Center, How are you all going about your work to think about these things as a set of interrelated issues as opposed to separate problems that are distinct?
Yeah, I was glad that I was here for part of that conversation because we see it as absolutely related. When Me Too went viral, it was a conversation not just about sexual violence and harassment. It was really a conversation that was much broader about what it meant to actually work with safety and equity and dignity. And so the Me Too stories people were telling, they were about harassment, but they were also about unfair pay. They were also about how hard it is to work and to engage in care. They were also about how entire classes of workers were just left out of our legal protections altogether. And so I don't see it as disconnected at all. I see it as actually interwoven in a way that's really powerful. And it is unsettling. Like, change is unsettling. And I completely recognize that. And I think a lot of institutions are grappling with what that means for them. What does it mean that they now have all of these people who have a lot of expectations that things are going to be different right away today, right? And that is what we hear over and over again from companies that they're facing in their workplace and facing from their consumers. And that is not just around pay. And one of the examples, one of the things the National Women's Law Center does is we house and help to found the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund. And over the last year, we've heard from thousands of people who have contacted us looking for legal assistance and communications and PR assistance. And in those early days of founding the fund, there were a lot of stories around what happens with Me Too going viral. And one of the stories was both a harassment and an equal pay story, where there was a film where someone involved had engaged in violence, and that person was no longer in the film. And they had to actually go back and redo some things.
I know
and
this
reshoot.
movie. Can I say it? It's public knowledge, isn't it? Can I spill this tea?
Go ahead.
Okay. It was All the Money in the World with Kevin Spacey, who was playing John Paul Getty, and then he left. Christopher Plummer took over this role, and they do reshoots. And Mark Wahlberg was in it, and Michelle Williams. And Mark Wahlberg basically got paid 10 times what Michelle Williams got paid for the reshoots.
That's right. And
What have I won?
That's right, you had. And part of it, what he said was, that's what they negotiated for me, right? He's like, that's what my agent negotiated. And the irony is that he and Michelle Williams were in the same agency, different agents, but same agency.
Not anymore.
And so she got the regular day rate and sort of saw her contribution in doing that as kind of a part of, this is all of us understanding that we need to move forward and finish this with new folks. And so anyway, a very long story short, the attention around the deep unfairness of that pay inequity, negotiated or not, was so strong that he really generously donated that money away.
Was it generous for him to do it?
Well, I think it was generous.
Well, I mean, I'm asking, it's an
It
honest
was a
question.
generous
Like, I
amount.
mean, do you?
He was not required under the law to do it, right? He was facing certain pressure, for sure.
For sure.
And really, the way that I've started to look at these things is, sure, he should be blamed, but really who should be blamed is the person making that pay decision. I think that going forward in those sorts of situations, the person, the company making those pay decisions, contractually or not, should be thinking in a way that is much bigger and bolder around how they are compensating for what is probably many, many, many years of underpaying women and pointing to things like negotiation and contract to justify it.
Right. So there's so many good Hollywood stories we could talk about with this. Claire Foy, Matt Smith, The Crown, all of it. But everyone looks like they might have questions. So I'm going to open it up to the audience to take some questions. Yes.
I'm curious from a performance standpoint, having been working with managers and being management yourself, do women have to kind of take it slower in terms of trying to innovate at companies, trying to come up with ideas? Because I know in my experience, I've come up with ideas, and a male supervisor will say, how the hell do you know in this point of time how to improve our business in this area? And 2 years later, a male will come up with the same idea and it'll be executed. At other points, people may say, you weren't brought on board to do this, you're brought on for this specific role, please stop. So do women have to kind of come on slower, absorb a little longer, and approach change and ideas in a very specific way? And if so, I'd love your thoughts about the best way to word new ideas.
So I feel like the last panel is probably the better panel to give you the real answer you want, because in my view, pay is just, sometimes you just have apples to apples differences in pay that show up, and you can look back at the point it was made and sort of say, this is how you make the fix. But oftentimes, to really fix the problem, you have to look at a lot of things that along the way, sometimes that are also infected with sex and race bias, to actually get at the problem. So your example of how new ideas are perceived when coming from women versus men, you sometimes you don't have to wait years to see that. You can sometimes see that in a room where a woman raises an idea, some reason no one seems to hear that idea, and then 20 minutes later a very similar thing is said, and there's lots of credit bestowed around the person. And there's actually a really funny story from the last administration where women said that they would speak up for each other. So if that happened in a single room, they would say, yes, that was a great idea, because when I heard it 10 minutes ago from Jane, I thought it was great then. And so to remind people in the room in real time that these were ideas that we should consider no matter whose voice they were coming from.
Gabrielle?
First of all, thank you both for your work in the world and for the panel, but especially for the work you're doing in the world. I had a question about sort of the structural possibilities for nonprofit reform around these issues. And I'm both an employer and an employee in the nonprofit sector. And one of the things that I find challenging is that I think there are some real sector-wide issues that both converge with and also maybe are distinct from those in the corporate world, in that there's a history of particularly white women of means doing this kind of work, or where that's a substitution for looking at issues of justice and equity and racial justice and gender justice and their intersection, where there's also this idea of sort of working for spiritual coin, and so there's also this martyr complex, and there's a lot of layers, and I want to be mindful of my time, but also that the structure is that the leadership of nonprofits are supervised by folks who are on board of directors, who are also often coming from the corporate world. And I'm always really interested in the sort of structural policy analysis. I'm wondering, particularly in your work in the nonprofit sphere, like what is the work that nonprofit employers can be doing to advance equity in deep and radical ways around pay and gender and racial justice?
Well, I don't think that you're wrong, that there are certain aspects of nonprofits that really contribute to that. I'll add one more, and that is, when your funding source tends to be a really restricted funding source, people don't want that money to go to things like working on equity. That's not what a lot of your funders are driving towards. They want every dollar to go to the specific program, and in some cases, many of those dollars to go out the door. So you have less flexible money to work on culture than, say, the private sector does. And at the same time, again, I think we're in a particular moment where a lot of the past ways of doing things are not going to keep cutting it. And so I actually think it's an interesting time to sort of be asking the question, like, what does it look like in this sector? What are some areas where we can really be leading in? What are some areas that if you're a smaller nonprofit, it actually, this particular solution doesn't work for you, but what are the solutions that can work for you? How do you pool resources with some other nonprofits to have some things in common? And so, you know, I really think when Me Too went viral, one of the things that I would tell people is that, oh, harassment is an everywhere problem. And I don't think people thought I was serious, but it really is an everywhere problem. Like every study that has been done has shown, I mean, it's worse in some places, but it is everywhere. And that is true about issues of inequity more broadly. They are everywhere, and you may have a very important social justice mission, but still have a problem. There was a recent New York Times piece that looked at progressive organizations and the ability to, and whether they were providing paid leave and how they were treating pregnant workers. And everywhere needs to actually really think about what it means to actually work and engage in care and what it means to have workplaces that are equitable and where people are treated with dignity. And for some of these organizations, I think it really highlighted the fact that we don't have national solutions yet for things like paid leave, and we should.
Yes, over here, and then Rachel and Zev.
Hi, focusing on your idea that the onus is on the employer somewhat to make this change, and trickling back to the Paul Weiss photo and the issue and the article. And what I read was their defense is that they had particular expertise that they needed to fill, and they didn't have the people of color or the women to fill that expertise, and the defense was kind of, what were we supposed to do? Like, and so my question is, not knowing anything else about that issue, but what does an employer, what options do they have if it's too late, or they're saying it's too late, when maybe they didn't have the diversity, or they didn't have the pipeline program, or they didn't attract the people, and now there are other issues coming from this lack of diversity. But what happens at that point?
Yeah, it's sort of, that justification is really hard when you think about how law firms work and this sort of weeding out of people along the way. And so you get to the final stage of people in the pool, oh, and nobody's there, everybody's gone. And the employer is typically not neutral in that nobody's there, everybody is gone piece of things. So I haven't read their full statement on it. I hope that part of their statement is commitment to what they're going to be doing starting today, so that they don't end up in a situation like the one that they are in. But I would say you cannot disconnect the issue of, even if you're only talking about a small number of people who are eligible for this level of a promotion, from all of the decisions they make along the way to either sponsor and promote someone, give someone an opportunity or not, push someone out or not, or encourage someone to leave by the fact that they haven't gotten any choice assignments while they're there. And so all of those sort of softer, intangible factors all along the way, and some of the harder ones, including pay, probably lead up to a moment where you have a sense of diversity where it's like red ties versus blue ties, like yellow tie in there, I'm sure they aren't happy about that in that story.
Rachel? I think it's on.
Oh, good. What a great conversation. I'm so delighted to be here. I am, at the risk of going back to something I know Melissa's mentioned many times, the problem of siloing, I just wanted to ask directly to you, Fatima, since you have the privilege, as you said, of kind of being in a place where you're looking holistically at these problems. What can we all do? And I think of, particularly, I'm wondering as an academic, but just to relate it to the rest of the audience, I mean, just in terms of our roles as women in professional positions, and sometimes in positions of power, to keep the conversation focused on the glue here of all of these issues. And I was really delighted that you mentioned Time's Up. When the Time's Up movement kind of came on the heels of Me Too, I was so delighted and relieved to see the conversation being directed to the issue of women's equality more broadly. It doesn't seem to have had the attention and I wonder if Me Too, we're starting to see the attention even on Me Too trail a little bit at this point. So how do we keep the conversation going, and how in particular do we keep that focus and really maybe re-educate somewhat around the connections between all of these different movements?
So it's sort of hard for me because I'm so in the weeds of all of it to see, and I will own that. But when we launched Time's Up, one of those rare things happened where you had a group of leading women with a lot of platform and huge microphones aligning themselves with workers that had organized across a range of sectors for a really long time. And not as sort of like, here, you domestic worker, I'm going to help you, really sort of saying, we're all sisters in the struggle together. And that sort of idea that you can and continue to organize across privilege is one that has been really exciting for all of us and motivating in new ways, and has elevated a whole bunch of issues that were not just were not breaking through. And that has not stopped. I don't know that people are always attributing it to it in the same way, but this year, for the first time, we're going to see a federal domestic worker Bill of Rights introduced. And we have seen in a number of places states move forward with one fair wage. And we have seen farm worker justice issues have a sort of elevation in ways that I have not seen in decades. And that is absolutely in part because of this alliance between these leading voices in the entertainment industry with longtime deep organizers. And in the nonprofit sector, people talk a lot about like all the work we're doing around culture change, and it's a huge strategy for many of us. But until you actually see the culture makers do culture change, you're like, oh, that's what that looks like. They're really good at it, it turns out.
Hey,
So-
hey. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Hey. So I want to offer a suggestion in the hope of soliciting your response to this, because I see, I'm a data scientist, and I've been working a lot all day, every day, in helping companies close the gender pay gap and fix problems. And I've been a strong advocate for data science and artificial intelligence to be used to reduce bias, to improve efficiencies, that simultaneously help companies perform better and are offered to them because they think it's a good thing, it's more optimal, and simultaneously reduce bias. So like the example Melissa gave about dean selection, the example you mentioned about law firms, the status quo creates this system. I call it the past president problem in data science, right? So like if you say, okay, Zev, can you predict from data which candidate of these 10 candidates would be the best next president of the United States? If we looked at the past presidents of the United States, there's only one person of color, and the rest are all white males. By the way, just like this room is lined with the pictures of old white guys who are the deans of NYU, it's very hard to use that past data if you just did it in the wrong way. If you erroneously used the data, you would say only men could be president of the United States, because if we look at the data, that's what we would derive. That's a misuse of data, that's a poor use of data. The reason why law schools are bad at picking deans is because they have suboptimal selection criteria. The reason why people are bad at picking board members. I was in a room full of NADC. You know what NADC is? It's like the giant, okay. I was speaking at NADC. There were two panelists who were also women. One was a person of color, the other was not a person of color. And she's on like big publicly traded boards. And she said, we can't find qualified female people of color to be on boards. It's impossible, they don't exist. And I said, I won't use the word I use, but I used BS. And here's why. The selection criteria are nonsense. The selection criteria they use are, have you been a C-suite person on a publicly traded company? That gets you onto the board of like a publicly traded company. I'm like, What are the criteria underlying that make you good or bad at being a board member? Do you have to be a C-suite person to no, of course, if you only select on that variable, you're gonna get Xerox. That's the only person you're gonna get. And it's a suboptimal, stupid way of doing it. My belief is that if you use data correctly, Paul Weiss is doing a terrible job I've been at law firms and watched law firms pick how they select partnerships, and I've used data to show them that it's suboptimal. Data will help, you show them the data and you use the data correctly, you can use it as a way to lever these changes instead of just admiring the problem. I think data is a really great lever to get companies to actually see how they can be better at being law firms. They can be better at being law schools, and at the same time achieve diversity goals and gender equality in ways that they thought, they say, oh, we can't, our hands are tied. We tried our best and we tried to recruit and we can't, because they're using suboptimal, old, bad, stupid status quo. You got to question the status quo and use data.
So I mean, it's interesting. I'd love to talk to you further about some of the AI use. I have some worries in other spaces about it being used in ways that are harmful and assume too much.
Yeah.
But I will say that what would it look like for it to be a piece of information in the room? And when you think about how some of those, staying with the partnership conversation, the different things that drive it, having a strong champion and voice, and a particular voice who's leaning hard for their guy, and, all sorts of things that are hard to quantify, right? And that may not actually relate to whether or not a particular individual will be this perfect partner. Having an additional, I don't want to call it neutral because it's informed by all these things, but an additional set of information, I could imagine shaking things up in ways that are interesting.
I think that with regard to the question before about what we can do, I have two thoughts and I'd welcome your opinions on them. One is, I think, enlisting the support of corporations, and I'm curious if there's anything analogous to the Giving Pledge that CEOs had to sign from a philanthropic perspective, if there's anything in terms of the Time's Up movement, getting CEOs to sign up and be on board. I think that would be great. Gillette just took a big stance in their ad, and there was a lot of controversy about it. I guess time will tell how their sales shape up, but I think it was a courageous step. And the second campaign that I would love to see is one focused on encouraging women to be mentors. Because I and a number of women I've spoken to in their careers have actually found that in many cases, women are less likely to be mentors. There's more competition. So I feel like a campaign about paying it forward would also be great.
Well, just, on pledges, the Obama White House did do an equal pay pledge where over 100 organizations signed up for it. They agreed to do pay audits and to address pay disparities in their workplace. It was not a very it didn't get into the nitty-gritty, but those organizations revealed themselves as the organizations that were committed in this way, and that was an important thing. Time's Up has definitely gotten people to make critical pledges. I don't know if you saw at Sundance, Tessa Thompson, who is an actress and producer, made a challenge where she said, I'm going to commit to change the fact that women directors are only 4% of those that are, I think it was only 4% of overall, but I could be wrong. But anyway, they're calling it the 4% pledge. And a lot of people have met her challenge and have said, I pledge to work with a women director this year. And producers said it, really actresses and actors that have a lot of leverage said it. And so I don't disagree with you that sort of competitive streak in all of us of pledges and challenges and being in the same pool of people doing good is a good approach.
So can I just add something to you? I'm so glad you brought up the Gillette ad about toxic masculinity, which got all of this blowback and all of these, I guess, incel guys were just like, I'm never shaving again or whatever.
Right,
I'm never
right.
using Gillette.
Right.
we might think of the problem of the pay gap as a species of toxic masculinity and talk about it in those terms.
I'm sort of, the Gillette ad happened right after the APA sort of named toxic masculinity as a problem, and I've been stunned by the blowback to it, as a mother of sons, as a person in the world. I've been stunned by the blowback on it, and I put it in the blowback on it in the context of a broader blowback. And that is, and I said this earlier, that change is hard. And really, in this moment, we are asking people to do things different from how they did them in the past, and to actually get at some of the root causes. And one of those root causes really is toxic masculinity. I don't know how you would say otherwise. So, every time I see a story like the Maggie Haberman story where she says, well, men in Davos are hand-wringing about mentoring women, I can't help but think, how many of them were actively mentoring women already? I mean, were they spending all of their days mentoring women and now they're putting a hard stop to it? I think we have to challenge a little bit some of this blowback, but take it very seriously too.
All right. So we are at the end of our time. I just want to say a few things. Like, this has been a really amazing morning. I hope you are as buoyed by the things you heard as I have been. I would love to thank Claire Whitman for all of the hard work that she did in bringing this all together. And I'd like to thank all of our amazing panelists and our final keynote conversationalist, Fatima Gosgraves. We have a little present for you. So I'm going to be like a 7-year-old boy and open your present for you.
I have one of those, so
Yeah, like I haven't opened a present in 6 years. This is a scarf for you, an infinity scarf, but it's printed with all of Justice Ginsburg's dissents, including her dissent in the Lilly Ledbetter case. So please wear it in good health. Thank you. And thank you to all of you. Please follow us on Twitter at BWLN_NYU. Thank you.